Hey there. I know you're out there looking for ways to boost your English fluency.
Yeah.
And I think we've all had that feeling of translating in our heads, and
Ugh, it's the worst.
it's like trying to run a race, but with like a mental translator just weighing us down.
It really is the worst. It makes conversations feel so unnatural and clunky because our brains are doing like double duty.
Right? Like we're trying to have a smooth conversation, but our brains are stuck in traffic.
Totally.
So today, we're going to deep dive into how to actually think in English.
Yes.
Instead of translating it, we're going to pull some really cool strategies from a podcast that really stuck with me.
Oh, awesome.
It's called How to Think in English and Stop Translating in Your Head. Tips to speak fluently.
Love that.
And I love that these tips are specifically for English learners.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that makes me extra confident that we're on the right track here.
Absolutely. And they jump right into the problem in this podcast and why that mental translation is holding us back. It's like our brains are just stuck in traffic and it creates this annoying delay.
It's like trying to dance, but you're missing every other beat.
Exactly.
So how do we ditch the translator and start thinking in English?
Right.
This podcast says the first step is surprisingly simple, and that's just to start naming everyday objects in English. And I'll admit, when I first heard that, I was like, really?
Yeah.
That's it?
It does sound almost too easy, doesn't it?
It does.
But think about it, like, we are surrounded by objects all the time.
We are.
So instead of thinking mesa or silla or whatever it might be in your native language,
Right.
consciously switch to thinking table and chair.
Yeah.
It's like a little mini mental workout for your English brain.
I love that.
Yeah.
And the podcast takes this even a step further and encourages us to like narrate our lives in English. Even simple actions like I'm opening the door or I'm making coffee.
Yeah, I love
It
it.
almost like creating a constant inner monologue in English.
Exactly. And the host even suggests to picture yourself doing those activities as you're describing them. So you're really layering on that mental engagement.
Okay, so we're starting small with our words and actions, but there's another technique this podcast emphasizes that I find really fascinating.
Okay.
Visualization.
Yes.
They talk about how it helps you create direct connections between English words and their meanings.
I love visualization. What's so powerful about it is that it bypasses translation entirely.
Wow.
You're not going from your native language to English. You're going straight to the concept.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like you're building this mental image dictionary in your brain.
The example they give is picturing a beach. So instead of translating the word beach from your native language,
Right.
you close your eyes and imagine the sand, the waves, the sun,
Oh, I love that.
all those vivid sensory details.
So powerful.
You know what's interesting to me? Neuroscientists are actually finding that our brains don't distinguish much between a real experience and one that we vividly imagine. So when we're creating those detailed mental pictures,
Yeah.
you're actually building those neural pathways that connect to that English word.
Wow.
It's like you're experiencing it firsthand.
That's such a good point.
Check.
It's not just some like fluffy self-help technique.
Right.
There's real science backing this up.
Yeah. And sometimes I get so caught up in trying to speak English perfectly
Yeah.
that I end up feeling stuck.
Oh, yeah.
So I was really relieved when the podcast emphasized the importance of keeping things simple,
Yes.
especially when it comes to sentences.
Uh-huh.
They encourage us to start with those really basic structures.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that most learners overcomplicate things?
Oh, absolutely. I see that all the time.
Yeah.
People get so hung up on grammar rules and complex vocabulary that they lose sight of the main goal,
Right.
which is to communicate.
Yeah.
This podcast reminds us that fluency is about getting your message across, not about sounding like a textbook.
And they also pointed out that even native English speakers don't speak in perfectly formed sentences all the time.
We don't.
We make mistakes. We use slang. We abbreviate.
All the time?
It's all a part of natural communication.
It is.
So starting with simple sentences like, I am happy, or the food is delicious. It's a great way to just build confidence and get comfortable expressing yourself in English.
Yes.
Like they're saying, forget trying to be Shakespeare, just talk.
I love that that is such a good analogy.
Thanks.
It's about building fluency brick by brick, starting with that strong foundation
Yeah.
of just simple, clear communication.
And you know what this reminds me of?
What?
The chunking concept in learning.
Oh, yeah.
Our brains learn best when information is presented in like manageable chunks.
Right.
So starting with simple sentences is like feeding your brain these bite-sized pieces of English
Love it.
that I can easily digest and absorb.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about starting small with objects and using simple sentences.
Yeah.
We've explored visualization.
Uh-huh.
The podcast then shifts gears to this idea of immersion. I think this is where things get really exciting.
I love immersion.
Yeah.
Because it gets at this concept of creating like an English ecosystem for yourself.
Oh, I like that English ecosystem.
Yeah.
And the podcast gives some really practical tips for creating this ecosystem.
Okay.
Of course, podcasts are a great starting point,
Of course.
but they also suggest things like watching movies and TV shows with subtitles, listening to English music, even switching the language settings on your phone and computer.
Yes.
I think that's brilliant, even if it feels a little weird at first.
I think so too. And I would even add that reading is another fantastic way to immerse yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be afraid to start with simpler materials like children's books or graded readers. They use a lot of clear language, and often they have fun illustrations that can help with comprehension.
I think a lot of people shy away from reading because they're worried about not understanding every single word.
Yeah.
But the point of immersion is not about perfect comprehension. It's about getting comfortable with the sounds and rhythms of the language.
Exactly.
It's about absorbing those patterns and letting your brain do the work in the background.
Yes. And the more you expose yourself to English, even passively, the more those patterns will start to click.
Right.
It's like your brain is gradually piecing together a puzzle.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, starting small, by naming objects, using simple sentences,
Yes.
embracing the power of visualization, and creating that immersive English ecosystem.
I love it.
What strikes me is that these tips aren't about forcing ourselves to think in English.
Right.
It's about gently nudging our brains in that direction.
Yeah, would you agree?
I would completely agree.
Absolutely. It's about setting up the right conditions for our brains to naturally start thinking in English.
Okay.
And the podcast has one final tip, which I think is probably the most crucial of all,
Right.
and that is to practice speaking without fear.
All right, let's dive into that in part 2.
So we laid out these strategies to shift your thinking into English.
Right.
And what's great is they build on each other. We're moving from those foundational steps like naming objects to this idea of really diving in and speaking without fear.
And I think for a lot of learners, this is where the real challenge lies.
Oh, yeah.
It's one thing to think about English in your head.
Right.
It's another to actually open your mouth and let it out.
Oh, totally. It can feel so vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like we're putting ourselves out there for judgment.
Exactly. But this podcast reminds us that making mistakes is not only inevitable, it's actually essential to the learning process.
Totally.
It's like give yourself permission to mess up, to stumble, to sound silly.
Yeah.
It's all part of the journey.
And the science backs that up.
Does it really?
Yeah, research has shown that our brains actually learn more from our mistakes than from our successes.
Interesting. I find that so reassuring.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I catch myself getting so hung up on trying to be perfect
Right.
that I end up not speaking at all.
Exactly.
So what are some ways that we can start to loosen up and embrace that mistakes are welcome mentality? What does the podcast recommend?
They talk about the importance of finding a safe space to practice.
Okay.
So this could be a language exchange partner, a conversation group, or even just a friend who's also learning English. The key is to find someone who is patient, supportive, and understanding.
It's about creating that environment where you feel comfortable experimenting, trying new things,
Yeah.
and yes, making those mistakes without fear of judgment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like learning to ride a bike.
Yeah.
You're going to fall a few times, maybe even scrape your knees,
Right.
but eventually you find your balance and you're off.
Exactly. And each time you fall, you learn something.
Yeah.
You adjust your approach. You try a different technique, and eventually you master the skill.
So finding that supportive community is key.
Yes.
But what if you don't have access to language partners or conversation groups?
Yeah.
Are there ways to practice speaking without fear, even if you're flying solo?
Absolutely.
Because let's be real, not everyone has a built-in English-speaking crew.
Exactly. And this is where that inner monologue we talked about earlier comes in handy.
Oh,
okay.
The podcast suggests talking to yourself in English, even if it feels a little strange at first.
Okay.
You can describe your day, practice those tricky sounds, or even have imaginary conversations.
I remember when I was learning Spanish, I used to talk to myself in the shower all the time.
That's great.
My roommates probably thought I was a little crazy,
Well,
but it really helped me get over that initial fear of speaking out loud.
that's awesome. And it's a technique you can use anytime, anywhere.
Right.
You can even record yourself speaking and then listen back to identify areas where you can improve.
So what strikes me about all these strategies is that they're all about building confidence step by step.
Yeah.
It's not about suddenly becoming a fluent speaker overnight.
Right.
It's about creating those small wins that gradually chip away at the fear and self-doubt.
And it's about celebrating those wins no matter how small they may seem.
I like that.
Did you manage to order your coffee in English today? High five.
Did you have a short conversation with your language partner without freezing up? That's amazing.
It's about shifting our focus from what we're doing wrong to what we're doing right.
Yes.
It's about acknowledging our progress and giving ourselves credit for the effort we're putting in.
Because that effort is what ultimately leads to fluency.
Yeah.
It's about showing up day after day, even when it feels challenging, and trusting that those small steps will eventually lead to big results.
That's such a powerful reminder.
Yeah.
It's not about perfection. It's about persistence.
Exactly.
So as we start to wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Okay.
what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listener with when it comes to practicing speaking without fear?
Well, first and foremost, remember that mistakes are your friends, not your enemies.
I love that mistakes are our friend.
Embrace them, learn from them, and keep moving forward.
And what else?
Find a safe space to practice, whether that's with a language partner, a conversation group, or even just talking to yourself.
Great point. Create that supportive environment where you can experiment and grow.
And finally, remember that fluency is a journey, not a destination. Celebrate your progress, no matter how small, and trust the process.
Those are some fantastic takeaways. So we've explored 5 powerful strategies for thinking in English.
Yes.
Starting small, embracing visualization, creating that immersive environment, and practicing speaking without fear. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to get your thoughts on how all these pieces fit together.
Let's explore that in part 3.
Okay, so we have covered so much in this deep dive into thinking in English.
We have.
We talked about starting small, using visualization, immersing ourselves in the language, and that all-important piece, practicing speaking without fear.
Yes.
As we wrap up, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on how all of these strategies work together.
Okay.
Is there a particular order we should follow, or is it more about just finding what clicks for each individual?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily about a rigid order. It's more about building momentum.
Okay.
Think of it like a snowball rolling downhill. You start with those small actions like naming objects and using simple sentences, and as you gain confidence, you add in the more challenging techniques like visualization and immersion.
Okay.
Each step reinforces the others, and before you know it, you've got this powerful force propelling you towards fluency.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's like those small actions create a chain reaction
I do.
that eventually leads to a major shift in how we think and speak in English.
Right.
It's not about forcing ourselves to think in English.
No.
It's about setting up the right conditions for our brains to naturally gravitate towards the language.
Exactly. And that's why practicing speaking without fear is so crucial.
Right.
It's the bridge that connects all these other strategies and allows us to really internalize the language. It's like taking all those mental reps and actually putting them into action in the real world.
Yeah. When I think about my own language learning journey, it was those moments of actually, speaking of stumbling through conversations and making those inevitable mistakes that really pushed me forward.
Yeah.
I remember feeling so nervous at first,
Oh, for sure.
but the more I spoke, the more those nerves just kind of dissipated and the more confident I became.
Exactly. It's like anything else we learn in life.
Right.
The more we do it, the more comfortable we become.
Yeah.
And then that comfort breeds confidence, which then fuels our desire to keep practicing and improving.
It becomes this positive feedback loop
Totally.
where every little bit of progress fuels the next step.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up today, I want to leave our listener with this: fluency is not some magical endpoint that we reach overnight.
No.
It's an ongoing process, a
Exactly.
continuous evolution.
And it's a journey that's filled with moments of frustration, of course.
Oh, yeah.
But also with moments of pure joy and excitement.
Yes.
It's the thrill of understanding a new concept, of having a conversation in English without constantly translating in your head, of realizing that you're actually starting to think in this new language.
And those moments are what make the whole journey so rewarding.
Absolutely.
So as we sign off today, I want to encourage you to keep exploring, keep practicing, keep embracing those moments of growth.
Yes.
Remember, every step you take, no matter how small, brings you closer to that fluency goal.
And if this deep dive has inspired you to take that next step, we highly recommend checking out the full podcast episode.
Yes.
How to Think in English and Stop Translating in Your Head. Tips to Speak Fluently.
It's packed with even more great advice and inspiring stories.
It is.
So until next time, keep those English gears turning.
Yes.
And remember, thinking in English is not just a goal, it's an adventure.